forthwith, when they were come out of the synagogue, they entered into the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John. But Simon's wife's mother, lay sick of a fever, and anon they tell him of her. And he came, took her by the hand, lifted her up, and immediately the fever left her, and she ministered unto them. We said verse 32, we'll stop there. What we read here is Mark's account of Jesus. He's at Peter and Andrew's house, and he heals Peter's mother-in-law. Matthew also gives record, Matthew chapter 8, verses 14 and 15. And Luke also gives record of this event in Luke chapter 4, verses 38 and 39. All three, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, mention the arrival of Jesus at Peter's house. In Matthew 8, verse 14, we read, "And when Jesus was come into Peter's house." Mark chapter 1, verse 29, in our text, it says, "They," that is, the apostles and Jesus, "entered into the house of Simon and Andrew." And in Luke chapter 4, verse 38, "And he," Jesus, "arose out of the synagogue and entered into Simon's house." So Jesus is in the house of Simon and Andrew. It's a picture of grace. It's a picture of mercy. It's a picture of the goodness of the Lord, that he would enter into their house. Now, just prior to this, Jesus had taught in the synagogue. In that same synagogue, he healed a demonic. And now he's in Peter and Andrew's house. And there's a need. We read in verse 30 of our text that Simon's wife's mother lay sick of a fever. So we have a picture of need. So Jesus is there, and there is need. Also there are some of his people. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all give record of the fact that Jesus healed Peter's mother-in-law. All three, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, record the fact that the fever left her. That was the root cause of the problem. And the Lord, as always, gets to the root cause. The fever left her. So what we have here is one of the many recorded healing miracles of Christ. And they all serve as reminders. They serve and they picture the desperate needs of sinful man. They all proclaim that Christ is greater than the needs of man. They all proclaim that Christ is able to overcome and meet those needs. So Mark and Luke record that the healing took place. Matthew does not record this, but Mark and Luke record that the healing took place after the apostles presented to Christ the need. Notice verse 30 of our text. And anon, they tell him of her. Anon. It's not a word that we use today. It's the Greek word euthos, and simply means straightway, immediately, without delay. So, she is sick with fever, and immediately, as soon as Jesus is in the house, immediately and without delay, they tell him of her. And it is from that phrase that we want to take the thought of the message. And anon, they tell him of her. That's the remedy to being mastered and controlled by circumstances. Immediately, tell the Lord. And that will keep you from being controlled by circumstances. So our subject this morning is without delay praying. I'm afraid many times God's people pray as a last resort. Our lives ought to be marked by without delay praying. It ought to be the first thing we do is seek Him. So what we have here is in this statement, and anon, they tell him of her. We have a picture of prayer. So let's look at verse 30. And anon, they tell him of her. The first word we want to notice is that conjunction and. And. It's a connecting word. So it connects to something. In this case, it connects to two facts, two things. It connects to the fact that Jesus was in their midst. And it connects to the fact that there was a need. Simon's wife's mother lay sick of a fever. So, in light of these two things, Jesus is in their midst, and there is this great need. In light of these two things, we come to this word, and. And. And that, of course, is followed by what the apostles did in relation to these two facts. Jesus is in their midst, and there is a need. So what did they do? Anon, they tell him of her. So Jesus is there. With that in mind, immediately they tell him of her. Without delay. They tell him of her. What you have here is a wonderful example of intercessory prayer, praying for others. They tell him of her. And what we read here is the kind of praying that we so desperately need today. Now in verse 30, notice that phrase. They tell him of her. That's prayer. That's prayer. All through the Scriptures, prayer is presented as a matter of great importance. It's a matter of great consequence. It's a matter of priority. Immediately they tell him of her. All through the Scriptures, in many ways, we are encouraged to pray. All through the Scriptures, we find instruction in praying. No one instructed more about praying than Jesus. There are examples of men and women all through the Scriptures praying. And we are invited to pray. We are invited by God to pray. Everything is ready on God's part for you and I to tell Him to pray. Prayer is an incomparable privilege. I don't think we understand the privilege of praying. The privilege of approaching God through Christ. It's a privilege. But it's also an obligation. It's a responsibility. Jesus said in Luke 18:1 that men ought always to pray. It's something that we ought to do. Whatever the circumstances, whatever the time, we ought to pray. We ought to always pray. That is, our lives are to be marked by prayer. Prayer is to mark our lives. It is what we ought to do. Well, I don't know what I should do. Well, you know one thing you ought to do. Pray. Pray. Men ought always to pray. So prayer in the Bible is this great privilege, this obligation, this responsibility that we have. But it's also presented as a need. It's something that we need to do. And it is also something that we need. We need others praying for us. It's a need. It's absolutely essential to spiritual health. Praying. If we do not pray, we're not spiritually healthy. Oh, you may convince yourself that you are, but I'm here to tell you you're sick. If we do not pray, we're diseased. Prayer is essential to spiritual health. Individuals need to pray. Families need to pray. Churches need to pray. It's a need. But not only is it a need, it's a valuable resource for the child of God. It is through prayer, according to Hebrews 4, that we find grace to help in time of need. As we approach the throne of grace, we find grace to help. In prayer, we find strength. We find enablement to do what God tells us to do, to be what God tells us to be. Through prayer, we can find joy. We can find peace and assurance. Maybe a storm all around us. But in prayer, there's peace. And there's assurance. It is through prayer that we find guidance. We find instruction. We find wisdom in praying. In prayer, we can find relief. And we can find comfort. We ought to be a people impressed to pray. We ought to be a people of prayer. Now in our text here in verse 30, they tell him of her. They tell him of her. Again, this is prayer. But look at that phrase. They tell him of her. 3 personal pronouns. They, him, and her. They, him, and her. So let's look at these 3. First of all, we have they. That's the people who are praying. That's the people that tell him of her. They. That's the people of prayer. Who are they? Well, in our text, it is Simon and Andrew and James and John. It's the apostles. And who do they represent? They represent the saved. They represent the called. They represent the forgiven, the justified, the reconciled, the spiritually alive. They are the partakers with Christ. They are the objects of God's love. They are the object of God's grace. They are the object of His mercy. They are the objects of His miraculous saving power. They are the ones who have been brought into a relationship with Christ. It's you and I that are saved. They are the ones who have access to God through Jesus Christ. They. Now, I believe that everyone ought to pray, saved and unsaved. Everyone ought to pray. But having said that, the Lord did not give the ministry of prayer to kings and judges. He gave the ministry and the open line of prayer to His blood-bought, redeemed people. That's who has the ministry of prayer. It will not hurt any unsaved person to pray. And they ought to pray. But they haven't been given the ministry to pray. I believe they ought to pray in the White House. I believe they ought to pray in the courthouse. I believe that there ought to be prayer in schools. But we, the saved, are the people of prayer. We're the they. It is we that can pray. We can pray. You know, I've heard people say, well, won't do any good for the unsaved to pray. I don't believe that. I don't believe that. It never hurts anyone to pray. And God can bless even the prayers of the unsaved. But the point is, it is you and I, the saved, that really have the ability to pray. And as you and I, the saved, that have been given the privilege to pray, the ministry to pray. Notice, they tell him. This is what they did. They tell him. The word tell conveys the idea of informing. If you tell something to somebody, you are informing them. You are giving them information, hopefully. You are notifying them. You are relating to them. You are revealing something to them. They tell him. They are informing him. They are relating to him. They are revealing something to him. Now he knows, but they tell him. And they did so out of a sense of need. Peter's mother-in-law is deathly sick, and they tell him of her. They do so out of a sense of need. They do so from a heart of concern. They do so with a burden. They tell him. They could see him there. They could see their need. His presence was a reality to them. So they told him. I believe we'd tell him more often if we could see him, if his presence was a reality. They knew him. You're more than likely not going to go up to a stranger on the street and tell them things about yourself. You tell things to people you know. They tell him. They knew him. And I believe the more that we know him, the more free we are to tell him. They were well acquainted with him. The more we are acquainted with someone, the more we tell them. There are people I know, and because I know them, I'm not telling them anything. And there are people you get more acquainted with, and you learn, you know what? Talk about the weather, and that's about it. But we need to really get to, the more we know Christ, the more at liberty we are to tell him. The more we're acquainted with him, the more at liberty we are to tell him. The more of a relationship that we have. And these individuals, they knew him. They were acquainted with him. They had a relationship with him. They felt an attachment to him. So they told him. But not only did they know him, not only were they acquainted with him and had a relationship with him and had an attachment to him, they felt a force. They felt an urge to tell him. They felt an urge to tell him. We've got to tell him. That needs to be us. In other words, they were moved to tell him. And in all circumstances, we ought to be moved to tell him. To tell him. They did so with faith. They knew that he was able to do something. They told him with assurance. They told him being persuaded and confident. They told him trusting him and with conviction concerning his person, his authority, his power, his love, his care, his willingness. They're convinced of all these things, so they tell him. Makes sense? So they tell him. They knew that he could, so they tell him. The matter was important to them. So they tell him. And again, anon, they tell him of her. They felt a real and present need, so they immediately told him. Their immediate impulse was to tell him. This was not their last resort. And anon, they tell him. This is what they did It's a simple statement of fact. Immediately, they tell him. Again, it's simply what they did. This was their reaction. This was their reaction to the fact that they had access to Jesus. We have access to Jesus. We have access to God through Jesus Christ. We ought to tell him. It is also their reaction to a present need. Peter's wife's mother lay sick of the fever. So they tell him. I believe it's what first came to their mind. They tell him. It was their instinct to tell him. It was their inclination to tell him. So we need to make personal examination. When faced with a need, what is the first thing that comes to mind? The very first thing. Is it to tell him? To tell him. Is that what first comes to our mind? Is that our instinct? Is that our inclination to tell him? When it comes to changes of life, when it comes to dangers, when it comes to temptations, when it comes to sorrows, and joys, and gains, and losses, when it comes to choices, when it comes to family, when it comes to health, or careers, or finances, or relationships, when it comes to our hearts, when it comes to our minds, our emotions, and situations in our lives, in our homes, or in the lives of others. What is our impulse? What is our impulse? What is our inclination? What is it that we do? Oh, may this be us. They tell him of her. That needs to be us. They felt a sense of urgency. So without delay, they tell him of her. Now Luke in his account, Luke 4 verse 38, says they besought him. They besought him. They felt the urgency of the situation. They felt their own helplessness, and therefore with great intensity and passion and fervency, they told him. They besought him. They pleaded with him. They told him all about her. Whatever it is, tell him. Tell him. Oh, may that always be our reaction to the situations of life. I've got to tell Jesus. I've got to tell him. May this be what we do. Tell him. May our lives be marked by that. That we are a people that tell him. So you have they. The next pronoun, personal pronoun, is him. That is the person they told. Be careful who you tell things to. But you don't have to be careful telling him. Him is who they addressed. So notice again, back in verse 30 of our text, they tell him of her. So between they and her is what? Him. You have they, you have her, and between the two is him. Him. He's the center. He's the center. They tell him. Does not say they told the neighbors. What anything neighbors could do. Doesn't merely say they told somebody. There's the mindset of many people, well, I've got to tell somebody. Well, why don't you just tell him? Why don't you just tell him? They tell him. Jesus was there. Why was he there? Well, he was there for them. And he was there for her. Makes good sense then to just tell him. Jesus was there. And he was Lord. And he was able. So they told him. Jesus was there. He's God. He's almighty. He's omniscient. He's all-sufficient. So they told him. Jesus is there and he's above all. He's over all. He's beyond all. So they told him. Jesus is there. He's God's provision. He's God's remedy. He's God's solution. So they told him. Now, how much sense does it make? Well, the Lord is here, and He's the solution to the problem. He's the remedy to the problem. He's sufficient for all our needs, but there's so-and-so over here, so I'm going to go talk to him for a while. That doesn't make any sense. That's foolish. Tell him. Tell him. Jesus was there. And He is the manifestation of God's love. He's the manifestation of God's grace, the manifestation of God's mercy and goodness. So they told Him. Jesus was there. He's the transformer of death. He can transform darkness. He can transform hopelessness. He can transform weakness and anguish and defeat and uncertainty and fear. Let's tell Him. So that's what they did. They tell Him. Jesus is there. Someone is sick. He is the physician. So they tell Him. He's the one who can sympathize and empathize. So they told Him. He's the life and heart fixer. So tell Him. Incomparable in His power, in His care, in His tenderness, in His kindness. So tell Him. Why is it that people go to other people, tell them, then get angry because the person they told, they didn't sympathize? Well, why don't you go to the one who does sympathize? The Lord. Tell Him. Tell Him. Well, I told so-and-so and they acted like they didn't care. Well, maybe they didn't. So tell the one who does care. We don't make sense. We get mad because we tell somebody something and they don't react like we expect them to. Tell Him. Tell Him. Not after you've told everyone else as a last resort. Without delay. Tell Him. He's here. He's in our situation. So tell Him. There's not a single problem in your life that He does not have the answer for. Not a single difficulty, not a single trial, not a single disease or need that He is not sufficient for. Tell Him. Tell Him. Because let me tell you something. It does matter who you tell. It does matter who you tell. Most of God's people, you tell them something, and the response is, I will make that a matter of prayer. Hopefully that's true. But here's a newsflash. Not everyone who says, I will pray about that, prays about it. A lot of people, that's just words. Tell Him. Just tell Him. You can't go wrong telling Him. They tell Him. And I want to tell you something else. He did not mind. Oh, there's a lot of things that I've been told through the years that I wish I was never told. But Jesus doesn't mind. Jesus doesn't mind. And there's a lot of things that I've been told through the years, and it caused me great worry and great concern. But whatever you tell Jesus, I'll tell you this, He doesn't worry. He doesn't worry. People will come and they say, I don't want to burden you with this, but I've got to tell you. And perhaps they do, and they tell us, and it burdens us in a good way, sometimes not in a good way. But you don't burden the Lord. Well, I've already told Him 5 times. Tell Him 6. It's not a burden to Him. It's not a bother. It's not a bother to Him. It doesn't weigh Him down. Tell Him. And I believe He wanted to hear it. I'll just be honest, and you will be too. I don't always want to hear what people have to say. I just really don't want to hear it. Because it's not that important. But He wants to hear. He wants to hear what we have to say. And I believe it pleased Him that they told Him. That they told Him. So you have they and her. Between the two is Him. Tell Him. Thirdly, we have her. That's the petition of the prayer. They tell Him of her. Of her. So they told Him of somebody that had a great need. Of somebody who is in a situation they could not help themselves. Here is somebody who needs a miracle. Everyone needs a miracle. So who do you tell? You tell the one who can work the miracle. No need to tell the one who can't. They tell Him of her. We're told in Matthew and Mark's account that she lay sick of a fever. But in Luke's account, keep in mind Luke was a physician, so he gives us a little more detail concerning her illness. he writes in Luke 4:38 that she was taken. That is, under the control. She was taken with a great fever. That is, a very serious, a very high fever. So there was an urgent need. The need is her. They tell him of her. Her speaks of necessities and burdens and troubles and trials and difficulties and concerns in Peter's home, in Peter's family. And they tell him of her. And everyone has individual and family necessities and burdens and troubles and trials and difficulties and concerns. And for every her, there's a him. They tell him of her. He's there for them. He's there for her. There's a him. We all have hers in our life. I'm not talking about females. I'm talking about needs and necessities. And for every one of those, there's him. There's him. Tell him. Trust him with your her, whatever it is. Then notice what Jesus did. Following them telling Jesus, we read in our text, verse 31, that he came, no doubt, to where she was lying in the house. Matthew 8:14 says, he saw. He came to where she was. He saw. Luke says in Luke 4:39 that he stood over her. He stood over her. So Jesus has drawn near to her. As he stood there in her presence, Luke records that he rebuked the fever. He addressed the problem. That's why you need to tell him. Because he will address the problem. Matthew and Mark both record that he touched her hand. And Mark says in our text, and lifted her up. So there was him. And he drew near to her. He came into contact with her. And he exercised his power upon her. And all of this was effectual because it says the fever left her. Because of him. Because of him. Because of what he is able to do. It says, Mark says, the fever, immediately the fever left her. That reveals the power of his presence. That reveals the power of his word, the power of his touch. It should encourage us. Tell him. Tell him. Tell him. Notice that there was also manifest evidence of the Lord's work in her life. Mark records that she ministered unto them. Matthew and Luke record she arose and ministered unto them. There was healing. There was a manifestation of healing. There was healing. There was service. Again, all of this should encourage us. Tell him. Tell him. There are always people who urgently need the blessings of God, who need the saving power of God, who need forgiving, who need delivering, who need hope, who need help. And He is able. So we, out of a heart of love, out of a heart of concern and compassion and desire, ought to immediately, without delay, tell Him. Tell Him of. You can put, in our text is, they tell Him of her. We can just stop with, they tell Him of, and you can put whatever you want on the other side of of. And you can tell Him. You can tell Him. So we need, again, to make personal examination. To what extent is our life characterized by telling Him? Telling Him. What role does prayer have in our life? Is it a major part of our life? When do we pray? I'm not talking about time of day, but when do we pray? What is it that causes us, moves us to pray? What motivates us to pray? Really, it ought to be Him, because of who He is. Prayer is to be such a significant part in our life that it's natural for us to pray. It's what we do. It's what we do. Is it natural? Is that our natural reaction to pray? Something happens. Something upsetting happens. Something disturbing happens. What is our reaction? The reaction of most is to pull out their cell phone. That's the first thing they do. And they start to text someone or call someone. Our first reaction ought to be to tell Him. And then if He tells you to pull out your cell phone and text someone and tell them, then do it. But until then, tell Him. Tell Him. It ought to be natural for us to pray. When the blessings are coming down upon us, everywhere we turn, there's the blessing of God. We ought to tell Him. When we're surrounded by trials and afflictions, we ought to tell Him. When we're healthy, we ought to pray. When we're sick, we ought to pray. When we're strong, we ought to pray. When we're weak, we ought to pray. It simply ought to be natural for us to pray. So again, to what extent is our life marked by prayer? How natural is it for us to pray? Again, in our text, verse 30. They, him, her. Whatever is between. Whatever the they or whatever the her is, in between the two is Him. Is Him. Never ever forget that. He's the center. God help us to tell Him. Brother Ben, if you'd come and lead us in verse song. Let's all